Hi everyone, I'm Mariah. I'm like Emily said, one of our science to implementation specialists. Our other science implementation specialist, Tegan, is also on today. So hopefully during the discussion, we can also benefit from her knowledge and experience. But our team focuses on sort of supporting our partners in bridging science and practice. And we work super closely with our communications team, although we're sort of like separated, like I guess organizationally. And in my opinion, maybe it's just because everyone on the communications team is so amazing. I feel like that's been going really well. So we wanted to talk a little bit today about sort of like science implementation. We also use the term tech transfer, and then sort of like how we're blending that with communications. So yeah, a little bit about my background is that my background is as a scientist. I have a PhD in forest and conservation scientist. And so really that was my training, was like being the scientist, but I didn't want to do research. I wanted to sort of like work in this in-between space and kind of, learn how to be that bridge between what we know and what we do. So we're going to talk a bit about that today. Yeah, so we're going to go over sort of what tech transfer is, sort of a definition that we've developed through a group that I'll talk a bit about that IWJV co-facilitates with TNC. It's sort of similar to this group, but focused on sort of the practice of tech transfer. We'll talk a bit about sort of like how these two areas, or how we think about these two areas overlapping. And then we'll provide an example from IWJV on how we've blended tech transfer and communications in our work using the wetland evaluation tool. And then of course, we'll have plenty of time for discussion, questions. Love to hear from you all. It's always fun to present, but it's also great to learn from everyone else on the call. So yeah, let's talk about what tech transfer is. And so this is something that I think, so this thinking is coming out of this group that I mentioned. It's called the Sagebrush Technical Transfer Network. And basically we're kind of a community of practice of folks who in some way work between science and management. People in the network do sort of a variety of things, from extension to sort of working more like in an agency role, to being a scientist that just really cares about outreach. And so we've sort of like co-produced in that group a lot of this content. So I won't take credit for this myself, and I will at the end sort of talk a bit more about the network in case anyone is interested in joining. So basically the framing around tech transfer is that, in many areas we're sort of growing quickly in terms of how much information exists about certain topics. So we work in sagebrush ecosystems, and there has been sort of a huge increase in science related to sagebrush. Every year, there's like something like 1,500 papers published on sagebrush. That's a huge amount of science, huge body of knowledge. And, I think many of us probably on this call, but also the people who are sort of tasked with using this information to make decisions about what happens on the ground, are sort of experiencing information overload. There's new science, there's best practices, there's, I swear, a new geospatial tool coming out every day, right? And it can be really hard to sort of stay on top of this and figure out like, okay, what's relevant to me and how does it apply to like the things that I work on, right? The goal for us with tech transfer is to think about sort of like avoiding the situation of information overload and learning to distill information, and so that the information that is sort of available to people is important, targeted, actionable, and empowering. And I'll just mention that the term tech transfer, I think sometimes our group has a little bit of a hard time with this term because it sounds a little bit like unidirectional, like we are transferring you the information. But we really view it as being very sort of, it's more of an exchange. So maybe we should rebrand and use a different term, but that's what we've sort of stuck with now. And so, yeah, again, the sort of the point here is like wanting to act sort of as a filter of like there's all this stuff. How do we get people the information that's important, targeted, actionable, and empowering. We want them to feel empowered to use information instead of just sort of like overwhelmed and overloaded and confused. So my next slide will cover sort of a definition that we've put together of tech transfer. So we define it as a collaborative participatory practice that supports the integration of relevant science, data, technology, and practices into natural resource management decisions and actions. So that's a lot of things. The collaborative and participatory part we feel are really important. Getting back to what I just mentioned about it's not supposed to be this sort of like one way, like, you know, we have the knowledge and we're giving it to you type of situation. It really requires the engagement of people who are generally generating knowledge in some way and people who are using knowledge in some way, and those groups do overlap. But we also, so our group is focused on generally sort of like natural resource management, and we have the term sagebrush in our name, but we believe that sort of this concept really applies to any type of ecosystem or sort of situation where, you know, there's information about something and people are tasked with using that information to make decisions or take action. So we're trying to empower managers and practitioners to sort of improve outcomes on the ground using information that we have. And I'll also mention that the word tech transfer is, you know, one term for this sort of practice. We also, we internally, it gets confusing, also use the term science to implementation. So that's sort of what our job titles are. But we view that as sort of synonymous. People might call it, so we call it technical transfer. Some people also say technology transfer. There's science integration. There's sort of extension. There's a lot of other terms that are like fairly similar. We've just kind of gone with tech transfer. So again, we're getting back to sort of this concept of bridging what we know with what we do. And what we know can be pretty broad. Like a lot of times we're focused on sort of more like Western science and geospatial data and things like that. But that does not have to be sort of like, we definitely don't view that as exclusive. The what we know can really be any type of information. And then what we do. So the actions that people are taking on the ground, the decisions that people are making. And that could be, you know, in our context, it's often land managers, for example, people at the Bureau of Land Management, NRCS, the Forest Service. But it could also be, you know, something really different, like a individual landowner or a person who has a choice to make about, you know, some type of action that they might individually take. If you click to the next slide, we'll see sort of this bridge appear. And so we kind of use this bridge metaphor to think about sort of the idea of bridging what we know and what we do. And the sharks are there because to sort of convey the idea that this can be something that's challenging, right? Like, I think all of us are probably pretty aware working in sort of this area that there's a whole lot of information that is often not used in sort of the management context that it can apply to. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And so the bridge is really sort of thinking about, okay, what are the things that we need to do in order to sort of like bridge those different barriers between knowledge and practice? So there's sort of 4 different pillars on the bridge. We're going to focus today on communicate and integrate because those are sort of what most relate to communications and tech transfer. But sort of the learning aspect would be kind of relating to like however knowledge is being generated. So whether that's through Western science, whether through that's through another method. And so that's really thinking about sort of like that developing information. And of course, people who are involved in the other pillars would necessarily be involved in sort of thinking about those learning priorities. Co-production of science is something that we often talk about now because we want the information that is produced to be relevant to the needs of people who are taking action or making decisions. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk a bit about the communicate slide or pillars. The way we sort of have distilled that is into sort of this idea of highlighting key takeaways, visualizing information creatively, painting a narrative, and focusing on topics of importance. So in this pillar, it's really about sort of like awareness and reaching broad audiences and sort of communicating about information that is out there and maybe why it's relevant and who it might be relevant to. But we really feel like for tech transfer, and so this pillar, I think, relates to communication specifically, but it also relates to tech transfer, and there's some overlap there, right, in terms of who might be doing that. We definitely see that within our organization. But our group really feels like to be sort of tech transfer, what's really important is this concept of integrating information. So that's really thinking about how can we filter and distill information and best practices from this sort of wide body of knowledge and integrate what's most relevant into sort of the decision-making context of the managers. So it's really about thinking, okay, how do these pieces of information fit into how people are making decisions and taking action? And again, like there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of people who do these different things. It's not just sort of like exclusive to someone who has tech transfer in their title. In fact, there's very few people who probably do, Tegan and I being maybe like half of them or something. And so it's really sort of a wide variety of different types of people who do these things. And so we really don't view it as sort of exclusive in that way. But again, like tech transfer integration is really a piece that we feel like is important. One way that we've sort of developed to sort of consider how we might how different actions might or what actions we might take in terms of tech transfer is called the proficiency pyramid. So we're thinking about sort of on one side of the pyramid, what level of proficiency do we want our audience to have? And so a key concept there is that is also related to the investment we might need to take. So if we're looking at sort of this bottom layer and we're thinking, okay, we want to reach a broad audience and we want them to gain awareness about some information, that might take lower investment. We can reach more people, but I don't know about you, I've never really been to a webinar where I was like, wow, that's changed my entire life. I can take action. I've like gained new skills, like everything is completely different. And now I'm just like on my merry way to like go build BDAs or something, right? If you've been to a webinar like that, that's pretty cool. And that person is probably special and extremely talented. But generally, those approaches that we use for sort of reaching broad audiences, bringing awareness to information or tools or things like that aren't going to get us all the way to action. And so on the other end of that pyramid is sort of this idea of, how do we get people to do something differently or do something new, right? And one of the approaches that we think about is sort of this place-based support. So really intensive efforts that are going to prepare a small group to take action. That's going to take a lot of investment. That's where we're really starting to think more about like integration and how do we get, people to integrate information or tools or skills into kind of their way of doing things. So on the next slide, I've sort of added, we have sort of this sort of similar concepts of proficiency. Yeah, so thinking about sort of like, we sort of viewed that same concepts of like, okay, a proficiency and investment and kind of the, is our goal to raise awareness, knowledge, skills, or action. And then we've kind of added some different approaches, common approaches that people use. So I wanted to use this to sort of talk about sort of how at IWJV, where we're super fortunate to have like two separate teams that do communications and tech transfer, how we've sort of overlapped those things. So we sort of see like some of these approaches that are more thinking about awareness and knowledge, webinars, fact sheets, reports, things like that are sort of like more tend to be in our comm shop, although that totally depends. Our team will do webinars and things like that as well. And then things that tend to be like a little bit more technical, in-person trainings, field-based trainings, sometimes like this concept of sort of place-based support would tend to be more tech transfery, but that's not always true. I think our team, we're very fortunate in that we all have a lot of different sort of skills and that overlap. So sometimes like I'll put stuff on the website, and in the example that Emily will talk about, the comms team have like really waded into the technical aspects of the wetland evaluation tool. So it's a bit fluid, but I think we do really well at sort of communicating internally and leveraging our strengths to kind of work together. And we folks on the S2I team, which is what we call our science to implementation team, we don't tend to have sort of formal training in communications in the way that our communications team does. And so we'll rely on those folks to give us good advice on how to sort of think about those types of things that maybe our science brains aren't so good at grasping. So I think we're super lucky to have just those really overlapping and complementary skill sets. What I wanted to mention is that the network that I introduced at the beginning, that we sort of developed a lot of these concepts with, is it's basically a community of practice that's built to sort of develop best practices and sort of develop the practice of technical transfer, right? So we produce content to help people sort of build their skills, and we also host trainings and other sort of approaches to sort of build capacity for doing tech transfer. So we have a website, and on that website there is we've developed some different content. One thing that we've done is sort of crowdsourced from our group what we call our tech transfer framework. So it's really it's a way to help folks think about the different steps of doing tech transfer. It provides kind of, the planning support for the planning process of what do I do before I do anything. So thinking of that time, that sort of like spectrum of approaches, what are the things that I would need to think about before I get to one of those? So that's available on the website. If you go to the next slide, Emily, there's a number of sort of different parts to that. We also have a paper that was published about a year ago that sort of like talks about using tech transfer to bridge science and action. And that is kind of a precursor to most of the concepts in that framework. So I didn't really get into most of that today, but I just wanted to let you know that that's there. And if you're interested, you could check it out. There's worksheets that go with each of those as well.
Cool. And I just wanted to say, like Mariah mentioned, she and the science implementation team, they don't necessarily have communications backgrounds, but they are like actually really phenomenal communicators. Mariah is a fabulous graphic designer, and all of those illustrations on the previous slides she made herself, and I think they're really cool. But as far as communications goes, because we're all communications professionals here, I kind of wanted to bring home this idea of technical transfer with an example of kind of how we've applied it through trying to roll out a very specific mapping tool, the wetland evaluation tool. So this guy came out 3 years ago now. It's essentially a Google Earth Engine powered mapping tool that shows wetland change across the Western US over like the last 40 years or so. This was basically the culmination of years and years and years of work and science on the behalf of our former spatial ecologist, Patrick Donnelly. He, through his years of looking at wetlands, looking at maps of wetlands, looking at satellite images of wetlands, and working with wetland managers on public refuges, on both federal and state, just wetland managers across the West, he kind of realized that there wasn't any single tool that showed this wetland change. So he made it. It has 3 modules. They're all kind of slightly different in what they look at, but kind of complex set of wetland data distilled down into this visual user interface. This was, and I'll kind of get into this a little bit more, but this was a very clear, like his experience in working with wetland managers showed him that this was a need. And so there was also a very clear audience that came along with that need of wetland managers. So one thing that we think about all the time as communicators is thinking about your audience. Who's the audience for this communications product? Who are you trying to get the message out to? That kind of already existed when this tool came along. We had a very clear set of people we were trying to reach out to. And a lot of the science that went into making this tool, we had already communicated about too, through various articles and speaking with partners, and just kind of developed over years and years. So this was the culmination of that. We basically had two ways that we were thinking about communicating this tool out. And one was that we wanted to make it as usable and as accessible to people as possible. So we recorded tutorials, made videos of that. We did fact sheets, user guides, all of this. We worked pretty closely with our science implementation team to make sure that it was accurate, based on actual user experience of what was needed to get people to be able to use this tool. And one thing that we really, really wanted to do was make it very easy to find, easy to access, all in one place. So we created a landing page on our website with a really simple URL, iwjv.org/wet. And we looked at that as like the one-stop shop. I made a lot of effort to keep it simple, very clear, like the links to the modules up front, the fact sheets, the user guides, all kind of in logical places throughout that, so that people wouldn't have to hunt around. We're basically reducing the barriers to access for this tool. And we have contact information for our science implementation team, for Patrick, just so that if people had this URL, there was really no reason that they couldn't figure out how to use this tool, either through materials we provided or by working with our team. And then our kind of communications goal with this is, exactly what we do all day, every day as communicators, is getting the word out. We did that through all of our traditional communications methods, social media. Megan made a couple of really fun reels, walking people through the different modules called 3 Weeks of Wet. Sent this out in our newsletter, asked partners to share about it in their newsletters, kind of all the stuff that we think about when we're thinking about getting some sort of communications product out there. However, I think probably the most effective way that we got the word out were just those direct to user communications. So these are the meetings that our science implementation team had with partners, the events that we went to and shared about the tool with different groups, the webinars we hosted with different organizations, trying to say, hey, this is a tool, this is how we think you could use it, what are your needs, that sort of a thing. Mariah kind of alluded earlier to that idea of collaborative and participatory communication or science transfer, and that's what this is. People are much more likely to get the tool and use it if they have someone sit down in a meeting with them and say, here's what this is, here's what I know you do, here's how I think you can use it. Do you have any questions for us? How can we make this better to make this fill your needs? So that was a huge part of the communications for the wetland evaluation tool. And I did almost none of that as the communication specialist. This was the rest of our team. And so, yeah, I just thought that was kind of a fun part of this, and seeing the effectiveness of really leaning on the rest of my team and using their connections and their knowledge to get this tool out there. The other part of our communications approach was something that is still kind of ongoing. We haven't done as much of as I would like, but something that is super effective. And I think getting people to use science and use tools is storytelling that shows how people are using this stuff on the ground, providing those examples of, such and such had this problem and turned to this tool, used it in this way, and this is what happened. And that's something we're continuing to strive to do, because that's like going to be the best way to market something, is to provide that example, kind of, you know, make it seem cool and easy and approachable to use the tool that you're essentially trying to sell, to market to folks. So we did, like, this has been totally an ongoing process. There was a really big push to get this tool out there when it first was developed, but because it's something that is still being used, it's totally an ongoing communications product or project. So we've learned some lessons as we've gone through and done this. And the biggest one, as I kind of already mentioned, is the importance of using your team. I think as communications professionals, we feel like it's our jobs to do the communications and to talk about this stuff. But I think with the wetland evaluation tool, it was very clear that, like, I was not going to be the most effective messenger, that our e-newsletter was not going to be the most effective messenger, not our social media, not any article that I or anybody else on our team could write. This was going to be Tegan sitting down with partners and really applying it to their work and talking to them one-on-one. So that was like a huge takeaway, and something that I think is really important when you're considering communicating about science, is that back and forth, that collaborative approach to getting it out that really, like, communication specialists can do a little bit of, but other folks on your team are probably going to do very effectively as well. We know this, right? Know your audience, understand them, understand, you know, what they're looking for, what their use for the tool might be. With the wetland evaluation tool, we kind of went into this having about half an audience. We knew that wetland managers across the West were needed this tool and could very easily apply it to their work just through Patrick's relationships and our work with them in the past. However, when we developed this tool, we also kind of thought, well, there might be this other audience of, like, NGOs, land trusts, people who could use it to back up their grant proposals, that sort of a thing. And that totally, you know, as we found out, there were folks in that side of things that totally wanted this tool and could use it and apply it, and that was great. But trying to communicate about this tool to that other audience it felt a little forced at times, and it has felt forced. Like, there have been times where it's been, you know, really natural to get people to use the tool from that kind of group. But on the whole, because there was no ask for this tool in the first place from that group, that it has been a little bit more of work on our part to try to get that tool out to them. Yeah, so it kind of, I'll try not to get on too much of a soapbox here, but that particular lesson of trying to really push this tool to an audience that didn't ask for it kind of had me step away from this experience. And like Mariah said, there are so many mapping tools out there. You could have a mapping tool for anything right now. And I think for the user, that can be a really complex space to navigate. And so I think as communications professionals, it is part of our jobs in helping promote these things to kind of push back on our team on some of these things. Is there really a need for this tool? Is it going to be the most effective way to communicate this science and connect folks to this data that you're trying to get out there? So yeah, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I think that it's definitely something that we should think about as we're working with our teams to put these tools out there. Are there ways we can maybe work with people who have already put something out there to enhance what they're doing? And we can also get creative and come up with fabulous ideas for communicating about science that maybe aren't mapping tools, if that's kind of a better fit for whatever science you're trying to get out there. That is all from me. I think we wanted to open it up to discussion, but I think I want to see if there are any questions for Mariah or me about all of this stuff that we just shared.
I was curious how often you all update the tool, and like when you update it, do you then like redo this whole process of sharing that you updated it and how to use it and all of that?
For the tools that we have, and I could totally see how that would be a big deal for some tools when it's like a total overhaul. For us, those updates are like the data layer is slightly different, or like I know we're going to change the URLs of all these tools soon, that kind of a thing. So we're pretty, like, it's pretty seamless for us to be able to get in there and change those things without having to make a huge communications fanfare about it. But I think where that's really important to communicate those changes is when you're working with partners one-on-one to like apply this tool to their work. So like Tegan, I would imagine that, you know, with some of the changes to what that have happened, you're going back to partners and saying, hey, just so you know, this thing that you liked using is now found over here, or, you know, kind of along those lines.
I'll just add there's a couple of parts of the wet tool that should be or can be updated every month as well. And so there is some kind of continuous new information that is available as well. But because it's available generally every month, yeah, we don't make like a big fanfare about it. It's just kind of something that when it's working, it should be there. And that's kind of something we try to communicate about to people as well if they need that more recent monthly data.
Mariah, there's a question for you in the chat from Stacy about how you gained graphic skills as someone that came in from science, the science side of things.
I guess I'm mostly just self-taught. I started when I was in grad school, I could get a free subscription to Illustrator. And so I started drawing some things for like related to my research. And then once I think people learned that that was something I could do in this job, I've been getting more and more requests for that. So it's not something that I maybe ever thought I'd like be doing for work, but it's been super fun. And it's, you know, I mean, a good way, I think, to communicate about science. And it's super fun for me because it, like, I have to think about sort of like the synthesis pieces and like, how do I break things down and then visually depict it? And then also like the visual part. So like, for example, right now I'm working on a graphic that will go to a group working on invasive angle grasses, and it shows basically like the kind of life cycle of 3 different invasive angle grasses. So the fun part is like drawing the different life stages and then figuring out like how do I fit them together and like what are the differences and how do I highlight that and like how do I visualize it. So yes, self-taught. I don't know that I'm like doing anything right, but there's a lot of stuff on the internet on how to use Illustrator.
I'd love to hear from you all, just if anybody has an experience they'd like to share about how they've like communicated out these kind of science-based tools in the past, and like how that's gone for you and your organization. Like, if there have been any challenges, anything that's been super successful, anything you'd do differently next time you did it.
I will say, well, we don't have one that I have worked on, but we are going to very soon. So it is helpful to like hear. It's like a mapping tool that shows relative abundance of species in joint venture kind of areas. I think you guys are involved in it. I don't know. I don't remember who's involved with it, but it's a bunch of different joint ventures. And yeah, this is very helpful to think about as we kind of like plan how to launch those and like what to do long term, and not just like, okay, we launched it and then what. So I will say this was very helpful.
Yeah, I would say I think among our team at IWJV, we have quite a lot of experience of sort of like launching or outreach on various tools, some of which we have made like wet, and then many that other people have made. And I would say like, you know, thinking back to sort of that like spectrum of approaches, using sort of many approaches along the spectrum to me has been the most effective. So you need like your webinars and sort of like user guides and stuff like that to reach a broad audience. But then, like Emily said, the one-on-one stuff where you can sit down and explain to people like how it works and why they might want to use it and things like that, is when you really start to see like uptake from people. So I think, and Tegan's done a lot of that as well for various tools. So that would be my sort of sense with that. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in.
I'm kind of curious if there are other ways that folks are thinking about that, like connection with the end user of the science. You know, we talked about like the kind of communications approach, that one-on-one collaborative approach, but I'm sure there's other ways to do it that we're not thinking of. And yeah, what are you guys all doing?
This was so great. I was super excited to hear the sagebrush side of this. We support SageCon in Oregon. It's been fun to see these parallels and like the work that you're doing and what we've supported. I think you're spot on with the one-on-one aspect. We don't produce tools quite this large or of this scale, but we tend to find like with stuff like this that we're going to partner organizations that have those existing relationships in the communities that need these kinds of resources and tools. And then how can we create supporting materials to have people bring in hand with them, whether it's an informational guide or like some sort of one pager that kind of describes the tool, and then like how can they like bring that as sort of a representative of the tool and make people excited about it and kind of have those existing relationships and build on it. So I think like that's the right approach for the most part, because a lot of times you send something out in a newsletter and it's going out into the ethers and it's not really seen, and or it's not hitting the right people who may not be as aware of that newsletter or that list. But yeah, I think like having those, I always am asking like, what can we do to help make like this existing tool more approachable, or like something that's going to catch someone's attention, so that, like they're aware of it. But it's great.
That's totally, I think, where this tech transfer process shines, is in that like back and forth that you get. Like it's not just you know, yeah, communicating something out into the ether, as you said. It is that like, let's co-build this tool essentially. Like we've done all the work here on the front end, but like, I don't know, Tegan, Mariah, like you guys uh, you guys get kind of feedback on these things quite a bit and take that and integrate it. I don't know if either of you want to speak to like how that kind of looks on your end, but I think that's the coolest part of it for sure.
I agree too. Like it's a really complicated process to get things to the people who want it and can use it. And I think one of the things that I get feedback on, and that Emily and I have talked about, is helping people use it in a way that they like to answer their questions or their challenges. And so I think there's this pull between wanting to be kind of prescriptive, like telling people like in this case you might do these sets of things, because people often just want you to kind of help them or tell them what's like useful and helpful, because they don't know either, right? Like we're all kind of struggling in so many ways in life to figure out what's best. So that pull between wanting to like help and be prescriptive, but also not wanting to pigeonhole people into a particular set of actions, especially when so much of conservation is really based on like local knowledge and kind of the microhabitat and all these kind of smaller factors that are really on the ground. And so that's just something that, yeah, we get feedback on. I'm sure many of you get that from people, like tell us what to do or tell us what's best. And so it's just that trying to figure out how to like give people options without telling them what to do is like a really hard thing. That's my feedback, and it's not helpful, but it is something that it looks like some of you can relate to.
Stacy's got a question in the chat that I think is like the opposite facing issue there. If there's any suggested approaches of how to frame outreach or tech transfer as like something that scientists should want to do, because scientists are all really busy and overloaded. Does anybody have any like hot tips for getting scientists to communicate?
So we actually, through the Sagebrush Tech Transfer Network, we recently had a tech transfer workshop for scientists. Incidentally, speaking of audience, like it was targeted towards scientists, but a bunch of other people showed up. So that was like a little bit funny. But I think the benefit to scientists of either like learning some of these skills themselves or partnering with other groups that do it is that, I mean, I think most scientists, not all scientists, but many scientists, like they want their work to be used. They do science because, especially in conservation, because they care about landscapes and wildlife and, you know, conservation and things like that, right? They're not just doing it because, like, I don't know, it's like the best paying job or something like that. Like, right? It's, they really care about those things. And so I think the sort of part about, yeah, like this is the way that we help people use the information that you're producing or that your field is producing. Because often in tech transfer, again, getting back to integration, we're like, you know, sometimes try to move away from like, let's do tech transfer on every single paper that comes out and more towards like, okay, when do we have like a body of science that's useful to people? And so, you know, I think there's a different approaches. There's some scientists who like want to be involved in that. They want to like be at the workshop. They want to be talking to people. They want to be like, you know, in the stream showing you how to build a VDA or whatever. Like there's some scientists like that. And like, you know, they have those skills, whether it's just because that's who they are as a person or they gain them in some way. And then there's others who like, you know, maybe they don't have the time or the interest in sort of like being that involved, but they do, you know, want to make sure that the information they're producing is like available to people and that, you know, I think that it's interpreted and applied in a way that is like sort of fits with, I don't know, like the information. So I think some scientists are concerned about people using their information incorrectly and things like that. So I think in the sense of like, okay, how do we think about like, how do we get scientists to engage in a way that's like not too much for them, leverages their skill set, but then helps us to like, you know, do our job, right? So like being in the bridge, it's super important to know about like the context of management. And we talk about that a lot. And what managers need, but it's also super important to have those relationships with scientists because often like they truly are the experts and sometimes you like really need that information. And so, you know, convincing them that like, oh, working with us is a way to like make sure that what you're doing is usable without you having to do it, right? And so we've sort of, in some of our workshops and things like that, we've suggested, think about this at the beginning, right? So it's not like, oh, I published a paper, hey, you know, is Keegan available for tech transfer, right? Like, how can we get folks to be thinking about it when they're sort of starting to do things like starting to plan, you know, putting in a proposal even? Can you put some funding in the proposal to help with tech transfer? Can you think about how that would fit into sort of like your process? And for us having like the tech transfer people, and I think communications probably as well involved earlier on, because when it's like, okay, it's all done, now like make this useful to people. Sometimes there's things that we might have wanted to do differently or, you know, relationships that we might have that would be like beneficial to the project. So it's just sort of like all in the spirit of collaboration and thinking ahead, I think is with that. Hopefully that answered your question. It's a bit of a ramble.
I also think to like, just to reiterate and hit hard, like as a communications person, trying to get a scientist to speak the same language as you is oftentimes really difficult. Like my brain is not a science brain. I don't do numbers. Like, it's really hard for me to think like that. And a lot of times the scientists are the opposite, and it's really hard for them to, you know, write a sentence that's not technical or that sort of a thing. But what I found works really well is just developing those relationships, like have some one-on-one time with, you know, the scientist whose work you're communicate, really dive in deep, like, okay, here's what I think the main messages from your science are. Does this look right to you? Kind of reflect back. And this is, you know, a strategy that I think would work really well for communicating this science out. Just make sure it's like that participatory, like generative type thing. It shouldn't be like this linear, like, science is produced and handed to the communications person, and communications person feeds it out to the masses. Like, that's not how this works effectively. So yeah, that just like lean into the relationships wherever possible, especially with those people who like aren't very good at doing this themselves. I know we take years of back and forth meetings about our science when it comes out to figure out how to best get it out there.
I think too, like a lot of scientists produce science like kind of first for publication or for some technical audience, and so I think, I don't know if sometimes they say things like managers can do this, but I don't think they often like actually think about, is a manager likely to read my paper and get the things that they need to out of it? So I do think there is like often the desire to connect it to management, but just a kind of lack of awareness, or yeah, there's something missing in that bridge that Mariah was mentioning, where it's like, how do we get from the knowledge production to the making it understandable part? So yeah, I think some of it is just like kind of reminding people, your language is not working for people, or just putting it in a way that's less technical can be hard, but it is important to kind of, yeah, help them through that.
Yeah, and it can be hard. We've definitely had instances where we've like tried to work really hard to be like, okay, this is a non-technical audience. Like, we really need to be like, you know, super general. And then like the talk happens and like the scientists are like, blah, 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 Bayesian statistics. And we're like, no, don't say that, right? Like, yeah, it's hard, right? Because we all know what we know, like, you know, for them, that's super important. And if they're giving that talk to a science audience, like talking about the methods is super important. So it's always sort of a process of just like, okay, how do we kind of like work with people and try to sort of like get somewhere that's like, yeah, more approachable, but it's not always, it's not always successful, I guess.